The soft hum of machines filled the dimly lit private suite as billionaire Adrian Cole lay perfectly still. Eyes closed, every breath calculated to appear unconscious. The scent of antiseptic and faint perfume lingered in the air, mixing with the quiet rhythm of the heart monitor beside him. To the world, he was a man in a coma, helpless, unaware, and trapped between life and death. But inside his mind, Adrian was wide awake, listening. It had been his idea to stage this illusion, a plan born out of bitterness and betrayal. After learning that his most trusted executives had conspired to sell his company behind his back, and that even his relatives were circling like vultures over his fortune, he decided he had to know the truth. Who among them truly cared for him as a person, not just for his wealth and influence? Days turned into weeks as he remained motionless, watching the world move around him through the thin veil of closed eyelids. The voices that once filled his life with false praise now revealed their true nature when they thought he couldn't hear. His business partners visited only to argue about what would happen to the company if he never woke up. "He should have signed those documents sooner," one of them muttered, unaware that Adrian's fingers twitched slightly under the blanket. His relatives came too, but their concern was hollow, dripping with greed. His cousin whispered to a nurse, "Do you know if the will's been updated?" Adrian's chest tightened. Every conversation, every sigh, every fake tear told him the same story. He had surrounded himself with people who loved his money more than they ever loved him. But amid that web of deceit, there was one voice that didn't carry the weight of lies. It was soft, gentle, and strangely comforting, the voice of Nurse Grace. She wasn't like the others. She didn't speak to him as though he were an object or a headline. She greeted him every morning with a simple, "Good morning, Mr. Cole. I hope you slept well," as if she truly believed he could hear her. Her hands were careful when she adjusted his blanket, her words calm when she checked his pulse. When the other nurses gossiped, she ignored them. Instead, she read books aloud to him, mostly stories about ordinary people finding hope after loss. "You'd probably like this one," she once said, chuckling softly. "It's about a man who had everything but realized what really mattered after he lost it all." Adrian almost smiled under the oxygen mask. There was irony in her words, a truth she didn't know she was speaking directly to him. He began to anticipate her voice, her footsteps, even the scent of lavender lotion she wore. It was the only thing keeping him sane as he endured the charade. The longer the act continued, the heavier the silence became when she left the room. Adrian began questioning his choices, not just the fake coma, but his entire life. Was he really testing others, or was he punishing himself for trusting the wrong people? Late one night, when the hospital was quiet and the lights dimmed, Grace came in humming softly. She sat beside him, resting her hand lightly on the edge of his bed. "You know," she whispered, "I think you can hear me. People like you always carry too much inside. Maybe this is your way of resting." Her words struck something deep within him, a truth he hadn't faced in years. She didn't know him, yet she understood him better than anyone else ever had. Outside the door, his lawyer argued with reporters. His family demanded updates, and investors whispered about his condition. But inside that room, time slowed. For the first time in his life, Adrian didn't feel like a billionaire, or a headline, or a powerful man. He felt human, vulnerable, flawed, and quietly grateful for a stranger's kindness. As another day ended, he realized that while he was pretending to be asleep, it was his heart that had been waking up all along. What began as an experiment to expose others was slowly becoming a revelation about himself. And deep down, he knew when he finally opened his eyes, the world would never look the same again. The days in the hospital passed slowly, marked only by the quiet rhythm of machines and the faint sunlight that spilled through the blinds. Yet for Adrian Cole, each morning began the same way, with a voice that had become the anchor to his still world. "Good morning, Mr. Cole. The sun's out today," Grace would say, her tone gentle but full of life. even though he lay motionless, pretending to be lost in a coma. Something in that voice made him feel seen, even in his silence. She would draw the curtains, let the morning light touch his face, and continue speaking as if they were old friends. She talked about ordinary things, the news, a funny story from the cafeteria, the music she loved, and sometimes, about her own life. Adrian listened to every word, as if they were the only real sounds in the world. He learned that she was caring for her sick mother at home, working double shifts to cover bills, and still saving money to return to medical school one day. Her voice never complained, though her tiredness was often clear between the pauses. She spoke with hope, with kindness, and with a sense of strength that Adrian hadn't seen in the people who surrounded him before his staged coma. It amazed him how someone who had so little could give so much warmth. In the past, Adrian had filled his days with meetings, power, and numbers that defined his worth. He had always believed that money was the only language people understood. But as Grace's words floated through the room, he began to realize how wrong he had been. The world outside his glass walls had been full of people like her people, who worked quietly, sacrificed endlessly, and still managed to smile. The more she spoke, the heavier the guilt grew inside him. He thought about the employees he had fired without thought, the charity letters he had ignored, and the family members he had pushed away in his climb to success. His entire empire, built on control and intellect, suddenly felt hollow compared to the gentle sincerity of one woman who didn't even know he was listening. Sometimes, when Grace thought no one was watching, she would hum softly while adjusting his pillow or checking his pulse. Her voice filled the room with peace, a melody that soothed the storm in his mind. At night, when she was gone, the silence felt unbearable. The same walls that once symbolized power now echoed with loneliness. Adrian began to look forward to her visits the way a child waits for dawn after a long night. Her footsteps in the hallway became his favorite sound. Even her sighs, tired but full of resolve, reminded him that she was real, human, and strong in ways he had never understood. One afternoon, she brought in a small portable speaker and played soft classical music. "I heard you liked this composer," she said, though she had no idea he could hear her. "I read about you once. You were called the man who built empires out of silence. Maybe this music will help you rest." Her words lingered in the air like a mirror, reflecting the irony of his situation. Yes, he had built empires out of silence, silencing emotion, silencing love, silencing his conscience. But now, in the quiet presence of someone so ordinary, yet extraordinary, that same silence was breaking him open. Every night before leaving, Grace whispered the same words. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Cole. Get some rest." It became a ritual, a promise that she would return, even when the rest of the world treated him like a headline waiting to fade. For the first time in his life, Adrian felt something close to trust. He didn't know why her words mattered so much, or why they made his chest ache with an emotion he couldn't name. He only knew that her kindness was changing something inside him, piece by piece. What started as an experiment to expose others' greed was slowly turning into an awakening of his own heart. One night, as rain tapped softly against the window, he heard her whisper to herself, unaware that he could hear, "I just hope when he wakes up, he's surrounded by people who truly care." Her words stayed with him long after she left. Lying there in the dark, Adrian realized he had spent his entire life surrounded by noise. But it was this quiet, voice-steady, selfless, and sincere that had finally made him feel alive. And though he couldn't speak it yet, a thought formed clearly in his mind. She wasn't just his nurse. She was the only person who had truly seen him. He didn't know it yet, but that voice would become the light guiding him out of the emptiness he had built around himself. The hospital was unusually still that night, the kind of silence that felt alive, heavy, waiting, and full of secrets. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the faint hum of the city far below. muted by the glass walls of Adrian Cole's private suite. The machines beside his bed blinked steadily, each beep marking the slow rhythm of time. Grace entered quietly, her shoes making no sound against the floor. She carried her usual clipboard, but didn't open it. Instead, she pulled a chair closer to his bedside and sat down with a sigh. Adrian, lying as still as ever, felt her presence immediately. He had grown attuned to every small thing about her, the soft scrape of the chair, the way she exhaled when she was tired, the quiet calm that seemed to follow her everywhere. Tonight, however, something about her felt different. The usual lightness in her voice was gone. She sat for a long while without speaking, simply watching him. Then, in a tone so fragile it barely carried across the room, she whispered, "Mr. Cole, I don't know why I keep talking to you." Her voice trembled with something deeper than exhaustion. It was pain. "Maybe because you remind me of my father." Adrian's heart almost stopped. Her father. It was the first time she had ever mentioned him in such a tone, full of longing and loss. Grace's eyes glistened under the faint light as she continued, her fingers nervously twisting the corner of the blanket. He was a good man, but people didn't see that. They saw his money, his power. When he got sick, everyone showed up pretending to care. But I saw the truth. They were waiting for him to die, not to heal. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And when he finally passed, he was surrounded by people who loved his wealth, not his heart. Her words came slowly, each one heavy with unspoken memories. "Sometimes, when I look at you lying here, I wonder if you've ever felt the same, if you've ever had people who stayed just because they cared about you, not because of what you could give them." Adrian wanted to move, to open his eyes, to tell her that he was listening, that her words were cutting through the layers of pride and loneliness he had built over a lifetime. But he couldn't, or maybe he wouldn't. Something in him knew that if he broke the silence now, it would ruin the purity of what she was sharing. So, he stayed perfectly still, his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of his act. While his mind burned with guilt and realization, Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice softening even more. "I know it sounds silly," she whispered, "but I talk to you because I feel like you can hear me. Maybe you can't, but I like to believe you do. And if you can, then I hope you know this. I just hope that when you wake up, you're surrounded by people who truly love you. Not what you have." The words echoed in Adrian's mind, like thunder in an empty valley. He had heard countless people speak around him since the day he decided to fake his coma. Business partners plotting, relatives whispering, friends revealing their greed. But none of those voices had ever pierced him the way hers did. There was no selfishness, no agenda, no mask. Just truth, raw and unfiltered. And that truth hit him harder than any betrayal ever could. His chest felt tight, his throat burned. He wanted to cry, but tears wouldn't come. He wanted to speak, but the weight of shame pressed him down. He thought about his own father, a man who had built an empire and died, surrounded by lawyers and accountants instead of love. Adrian had promised himself he'd never end up like that. Yet here he was, more alone than ever, pretending to be dead to learn who truly cared. And in the middle of that act, the only person who had shown real compassion was someone he had overlooked all his life, the kind of person he used to pass by without a second thought. Grace wiped her eyes and smiled faintly, unaware that she had just changed everything inside the man lying before her. "You'll wake up soon," she said softly, standing to leave. "And I hope you find the right people waiting for you." When she left, the room felt emptier than it ever had. Adrian lay there, his mind racing with memories of boardrooms, contracts, and cold dinners, eaten alone. Her words replayed over and over. "I just hope you're surrounded by people who truly love you." He had spent years building walls to protect himself from betrayal, but now those same walls felt like a prison. In the quiet hum of machines, he made himself a silent promise. When he opened his eyes, things would be different. Not just for him, but for the people who had forgotten what it meant to care. That night, for the first time in a long time, Adrian Cole didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt human. The morning light crept slowly through the blinds of the hospital room, spilling gold across the sterile floor. The soft beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound, steady, calm, familiar. But today, something was different. Adrian Cole's eyes were open. For the first time in months, he wasn't pretending. His heart pounded, with a mix of fear and freedom, as he sat up slowly, muscles aching from weeks of stillness. The world seemed sharper, clearer. Every sound, the rustle of sheets, the hum of machines, felt like a reminder that he was alive and that he was done hiding. He stared at the door, waiting. He didn't know what he would say when she walked in. Grace, the one person who had unknowingly held a mirror to his soul. Moments later, the door opened quietly, as it always did. Grace entered with her clipboard tucked under her arm, humming softly to herself, ready to begin another day beside the man she believed was lost in silence. But as she turned toward the bed, the clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. Adrian was sitting upright, his eyes open, watching her with an expression that was both gentle and haunted. For a second, the world stopped between them. You're awake," she whispered, disbelief and shock mixing in her trembling voice. Adrian's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. "Yes," he said quietly. His voice was raspy, but full of emotion. "I've been awake for a long time." Grace stood frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Her heart raced as her mind tried to piece together what this meant. "What do you mean?" she asked slowly, taking a step closer. Adrian's eyes softened, filled with both shame and sincerity. "I heard everything," he said. "Every word you spoke, every story, every time you told me about your mother and your father." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "You were the only real person in this room. Everyone else came here for something, power, money, favor, but you came with kindness." Grace's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of his bed. "You heard me," she repeated, her voice small. "The whole time." He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "Yes, I was never in a coma. It was all an act, an experiment. I wanted to see who truly cared about me." The room filled with silence, heavy and electric. Grace stepped back, her face pale. Her mind raced through every moment, every word she had spoken, every confession she had made beside a man she thought couldn't hear. Her chest tightened. "You mean, you were listening to me pour my heart out while you were just pretending?" she said, her tone trembling between anger and disbelief. Adrian lowered his head, guilt washing over him like a tide. "I didn't plan for it to go that far," he said. "I wanted to understand the truth. I thought I'd feel powerful knowing who cared about me. But instead, I felt smaller every day." Grace didn't respond at first. She stared at him, her emotions torn between betrayal and compassion. This man, the billionaire who could buy anything, had played God with people's trust. Yet he looked more broken now than anyone she had ever seen. "You had everything," she said quietly, "and still needed to test love, like it was a business deal." Her voice wasn't cruel, but it cut through him, sharper than any accusation. Adrian wiped his eyes, his voice unsteady. "I know, and now I see how wrong I was. You showed me what real care looks like, something I'd forgotten existed." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of truth hung heavy in the air. Grace's heart softened, despite her anger. She saw the remorse in his eyes, the raw honesty that couldn't be faked. Finally, she took a breath and said, "Maybe now you know who you really are." Her words were simple, but they hit him harder than anything else he had ever heard. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was truth, the kind he couldn't escape anymore. Adrian looked up at her, tears slipping down his face, and nodded slowly. "You're right," he whispered. "For the first time in my life, I think I do." Grace turned away, gathering her fallen clipboard, her expression unreadable. Before leaving, she paused at the door and said softly, "Money can't buy people, Mr. Cole. It only reveals who they really are." Then she was gone, leaving him alone with the sound of his own heartbeat, loud, human, and painfully real. As the door clicked shut, Adrian leaned back against the pillows, the sunlight warming his face. For the first time, the brightness didn't blind him, it healed him. And he knew, in that quiet room, that no amount of wealth could ever measure up to the worth of one honest soul who had spoken to him when he was pretending to be asleep. Months had passed since the day Adrian Cole opened his eyes, but his world was no longer the same. The empire he had built, the fortune he had guarded, and the power he once thought defined him, all of it felt meaningless now. The boardroom meetings, the endless deals, the empty praise, they seemed like echoes of another life. He no longer woke up to chase numbers or conquer markets. Instead, he woke up every morning with a question that haunted him in the best way possible. What kind of man do I want to be remembered as? The answer led him down a path that few could understand. Quietly, without any press conference or public announcement, Adrian began dismantling pieces of his empire. He sold off his company shares, liquidated assets, and transferred much of his wealth into something new, something he hoped would matter long after he was gone. He called it the Grace Foundation. It wasn't just a charity. It was a promise, a living symbol of the woman whose words had shaken him awake. The foundation's mission was simple, yet powerful, to support healthcare workers in training, offering scholarships, resources, and emotional support to those who dedicated their lives to helping others. When the media got wind of it, they called it a billionaire's gesture of gratitude. But Adrian didn't see it that way. For him, it wasn't charity. It was redemption. In the months following his revelation, Adrian lived quietly, away from the spotlight. He had no interest in interviews or applause. The public praised his transformation, but few knew the real story, that behind every act of kindness was the memory of one woman's honesty. Grace had stopped working at the hospital shortly after their confrontation. She'd gone back to medical school, continuing the dream she had once shared beside his hospital bed. He hadn't seen her since that day, but she lived in every decision he made. One rainy afternoon, Adrian visited a small hospital on the outskirts of the city, wearing a plain coat and no entourage. It was the facility where Grace's mother was being treated, the woman he had heard about countless times during his fake coma. Quietly, without introducing himself, he paid off every last bill in her name. When the hospital clerk asked for details, he simply said, "Just make sure she gets the best care possible," and left before anyone could stop him. As he stepped outside into the drizzle, for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the weight of his wealth. He felt peace. Grace, meanwhile, had no idea. She continued her studies, unaware of the ways her words had changed the course of a billionaire's life. The day she graduated from medical school was bright and filled with laughter. Her classmates tossed their caps in the air, while families cheered from the stands. Among the flowers and congratulatory notes she received, there was one small white envelope with no return address. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, unmistakably familiar. It read, "Thank you for reminding me what it means to be human, AC." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The world around her blurred as she reread the note, tears forming in her eyes. It wasn't signed with his full name, but she didn't need it to be. She knew exactly who it was from. Grace pressed the letter to her chest and looked up at the sky. She thought about that quiet man who had once pretended to be asleep, just to learn who cared about him and who had woken up a completely different person. He had tested love like an experiment, but in the end, love had tested him and won. A smile spread across her face, not of pride, but of peace. Somewhere out there, She knew Adrian had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not approval, not loyalty, but meaning. Months later, the Grace Foundation became one of the most respected organizations in the country, helping thousands of nurses and medical students like her. Grace joined the board years after, continuing the mission that had been inspired by a moment of truth shared in a quiet hospital room. As she walked through the foundation's halls one evening, she stopped before a plaque on the wall. It read, "Founded in honor of those who heal with heart, not for reward, but for humanity." Below it, in small letters, were the initials A. See, she smiled, whispering softly, "You did it." Far from the noise of fame and fortune, Adrian Cole had rebuilt his life on something stronger than power: compassion. The man who once pretended to be in a coma had finally woken up for real, not just to life, but to love, humility, and truth. And though he had vanished from the public eye, his legacy lived on, not in bank accounts or skyscrapers, but in the hearts of people touched by the kindness of a man who learned, too late perhaps, that being human was the greatest wealth of all.